want to thank also my two speakers previously. You've kept time very well. And now I'm going to call on the next speaker to my left, Fabian. He's a UK Labour Member of Parliament and Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. Before that, he served on the International Development Committee for 3 years and on the influential House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee for 10 years. He has concentrated on international relations, focusing on human rights, aid, and development. And his topic is power politics and the Tibetan question. Mr. Hamilton.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair, and it is a pleasure to follow my dear friend Åsa Skarphédinsson. We've known each other for many, many years, and I have a huge admiration for his work and his influence here in Iceland and in many countries in the world. I should, before I start, just make a little disclaimer. I am speaking, Madam Chair, today in a personal capacity. I'm not speaking as an official spokesperson for the Labour Party, in spite of my role as a shadow minister, and the reason will become clear in a few minutes. And before I start, I just want to really add my thanks to Ömunda Jónasson, my dear friend, and of course the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy and the Icelandic people for making today possible. I think so far it's been an extraordinary and wonderful day. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1952, the German mountaineer and former member of the Nazi Party, Heinrich Harrer, published his seminal book, 7 Years in Tibet, recounting his extraordinary travels in Tibet from 1944 until 1951. Well, today I will attempt to give you 7 minutes on Tibet. The historic references over hundreds of years and throughout the world prove beyond doubt that Tibet was always an independent nation. It was a feudal society based upon a strand of Buddhism whose senior cleric, known as the Dalai Lama, was also the head of state. So the claim of China's ruling Communist Party that Tibet is and always has been a province of China is not only historically mistaken, but also deeply disingenuous. In 1951, the Chinese Red Army invaded Tibet with little resistance and arrived in Lhasa, its capital. Believing that the young 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, could be persuaded to act as a puppet, the occupying forces, backed up by a visit to Beijing to meet the party chairman at the time, Mao Zedong, spent 8 years trying to convince the young Dalai Lama to collaborate. But on hearing of a plot to assassinate him in 1959, he fled overnight to India and was allowed to live in the town of Dharamsala in Himachal Pradesh by the then Prime Minister Nehru. And he settled there in exile. At 81 years old this July, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is still there, together with the exiled Tibetan government and parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, today in China, it's a criminal offense to display a portrait of the Dalai Lama in public or indeed in private. And many Tibetans have been arrested and imprisoned simply for showing their silent support for someone the Chinese regard and describe as a splittist and a terrorist. Tragically, to this day, most Tibetans find themselves as second-class citizens in their own land. The Chinese have attempted to comprehensively destroy the Tibetan language and culture. Han Chinese people have been encouraged to travel using the new Qinghai to Lhasa Railway, which opened in 2006, and to settle in Tibet. Tibetans find it increasingly hard to get jobs in any frontline work which involves contact with the public. Indeed, speaking Tibetan in public is discouraged and not taught in primary or secondary schools, and native Tibetan speakers cannot work front of house in tourist hotels, for example. The rights of Tibetan people, both collectively and in the case of individuals and families, have been horribly breached. Religious freedoms have been attacked for decades. Religious institutions have now been suborned by the state. Along with the call from the political head of the Tibetan Autonomous Region for, and I quote, Buddhist temples to become propaganda centers for the party, there are proposed new counter-terrorism laws which allow for sweeping measures to be taken to suppress religious activity. Many rights which are central to the traditional worship of the Tibetan people, such as the lighting of butter candles, are now to be treated as subversive acts as they imply support for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In 2008, the acclaimed Tibetan film director Dondup Wangchen was arrested for making a film which was critical of the Chinese government for not allowing Tibetan involvement in that year's Olympic Games held in Beijing. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and was only released earlier this year, his health destroyed by contracting hepatitis C whilst serving his sentence. Meanwhile, for 8 years, his wife Lama Tso and her 3 young children were also punished for his so-called crimes and were left to fend for themselves with no home or income. There are many more serious human rights violations carried out by the Chinese authorities in the name of, and I quote, state security. For example, monastic leaders like Tado Gyaltsen was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment simply for possessing copies of the Dalai Lama's religious teachings. Geshe Nangwang Jamyang was beaten to death in jail. Tenzin Delek Rinpoche was sentenced to death for alleged involvement in a bomb plot for which there was absolutely no evidence. His sentence was later commuted to life in jail. He's now served 7 years in spite of representations from scores of countries throughout the world that he be released immediately, and he's currently believed to be in dangerously poor health. For these prisoners, as for so many other political prisoners, justice is very hard to achieve. There are at present over 600 known political prisoners in Tibet alone. Lawyers and human rights campaigners who take up their cases and the cases of such prisoners are often threatened and in many cases lose their license to practice law. Human rights violations throughout the world are rightly focused upon by many nations and thousands of individuals. But in order to stop those abuses, we need to know about them in the first place. One of the worst aspects of human rights violations in Tibet is that reporting is forbidden because the media is so strictly controlled by the state. So the world knows far less about what's going on in that remote part of what is now universally recognized as China, the so-called Tibetan Autonomous Region. My conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, therefore, is that even before we can prevent the abuse of our fellow human beings, we need the sunlight of exposure by the media first. A genuinely free media is surely the prerequisite of the struggles against human rights violations, whether they be in Tibet or Burma, Kashmir or Kurdistan. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that freedom is a human right, and that human right must always be indivisible. Thank you.
Thank you for that food for thought, Fabian. Indeed, political persecution is a big problem in the world today. And as he was speaking, I could almost see some African countries where political opponents are so persecuted. Their families are punished for their views. No lawyer can take up their cases. The press that dare to expose what the state is doing to these individuals is often punished through licensing procedures and so on and so forth. It's not easy to take on the might of a state when the state violates individual human rights. And I think this is indeed food for thought for us to be able to recognize that when these individuals' rights are violated by states, we ought to come up with solutions as to how to help these individuals.